What if I told you that you could break a perfectly healthy child, damage their confidence, their voice, their sense of who they are, using nothing but words? No violence, no punishment, just words repeated day after day until the child believes them. In 1939, a group of scientists didn't just believe this was possible, they decided to prove it. And to prove it, they needed children who had no parents to protect them, no one to complain, no one to ever check what was being done to them. So they went to an orphanage. They took a group of happy, normal, fluent children, kids with nothing wrong with them at all, and set out to convince each one that they were broken, that something was deeply wrong with the way they spoke, over and over, to see if words alone could damage a child from the inside out. It worked well enough that the scientists' own colleagues gave it a name they'd try to bury for 60 years, the monster study. Today, I'll show you exactly what they did, why it still matters to you, and the disturbing truth about the theory they hurt those children to prove. The place was the Iowa Soldiers' Orphans home. The year was 1939. And the mind behind the experiment was, in a way, a tragic figure himself, a respected scientist who had spent his whole life tormented by a severe stutter, desperate to understand where stuttering comes from. That personal pain led him to a radical theory, and that theory led him to do something monstrous to children who trusted the adults around them. His graduate student carried it out, visiting the orphanage for months, working with 22 children. And here's the core of what makes this so chilling. They took a group of children who spoke perfectly normally, and they began, systematically, to tell them they were turning into stutterers, to criticize every tiny hesitation in their speech, to make them terrified of opening their mouths. They even instructed the children's caretakers to treat them as if something was wrong with them. They were running an experiment to see if you could manufacture a defect in a human being purely by convincing them it was there. Now, 3 things you need to see coming, and each one is worse than the last. First, what this actually did to those children, because the results were not what the scientists expected. Second, the fact that this was so shameful they hid it for 60 years, and it only came to light by accident. And third, the part that turns tragedy into something almost unbearable, the theory these children were harmed to prove. Modern science says it was largely wrong. They may have damaged kids for nothing. Let's start with the man and the terrible logic that led him here. To understand this, you have to understand the man, because he wasn't a cartoon villain. He was a brilliant, driven scientist who had suffered enormously, and that's what makes this so complicated. He had stuttered severely since childhood. He'd been teased, humiliated, and had spent years searching for a cure for the affliction that had shaped his entire life. That's a sympathetic starting point, but it led him somewhere dark. At the time, most scientists believed stuttering was something you were born with, a physical or neurological defect. He came to believe the opposite, and his idea was genuinely revolutionary. He suspected that stuttering wasn't born in the child at all. It was created by the adults around them. His theory went like this. Every young child has little bumps and hesitations in their speech. It's completely normal. But if anxious parents or teachers start reacting to those normal bumps as a problem, correcting the child, labeling them, making them self-conscious, the child becomes terrified of their own speech. And that fear and self-consciousness is what turns normal childhood hesitation into a real, lifelong stutter. In other words, he believed the diagnosis itself could create the disorder. The label makes the thing it names. Now sit with the terrible logic that follows. If labeling a child as a stutterer can create a stutterer, then you could prove your theory by taking perfectly fluent children and labeling them, by deliberately doing to healthy kids the exact thing he believed damaged children accidentally. The theory that came from compassion, from wanting to save children from a lifetime of what he'd suffered, curved into a plan to intentionally inflict it on orphans to see if it would take hold. And that is exactly what happened next. Here's how it was carried out, and I'll tell it plainly, with respect for the children involved. 22 orphans took part. The researchers sorted them into groups. Some of the children genuinely did stutter. But the truly disturbing part of the experiment focused on a group of children who spoke completely normally. Fluent, ordinary kids with no speech problem at all. And why orphans? This is the part you can't look away from. These were children with no parents, no advocates, no one on the outside paying attention to what happened to them. In an orphanage, an adult with a clipboard and an official title had near total authority and no one to answer to. The very thing that made these children vulnerable. Being alone in the world is exactly why they were chosen. Their defenselessness was a feature of the experiment. Then the negative treatment began. These fluent children were repeatedly told that their speech was faltering, that they were beginning to stutter, that they needed to stop and correct themselves and be careful. Every small, normal hesitation, the kind every human makes, was seized on and treated as evidence of a growing problem. The children were pressured, criticized, and made intensely self-conscious about something that, until these adults arrived, they'd never worried about for a single second. And the staff who cared for them were told the same story. So the message that something is wrong with the way you talk surrounded these kids from every direction, with no escape and no one to tell them it wasn't true. Think about what that does to a child, an adult authority figure, someone you're supposed to trust, telling you again and again that you're broken. When you're a child, you don't question that. You believe it, you absorb it. And slowly, some of these children began to change, not in the way the scientists predicted, but in a way that would follow some of them for the rest of their lives. Here's the first twist, and it's important to be accurate. The experiment did not do what the scientists set out to prove. None of the fluent children turned into clinical stutterers. Labeling them, as it turned out, did not manufacture the specific disorder he was trying to create. On the narrow scientific question, the experiment essentially failed. But that's not the same as saying nothing happened. Because something did happen, something the scientists hadn't fully bargained for. The words changed the children. Kids who had spoken freely became self-conscious and afraid to speak. Some grew reluctant to talk at all, covering their mouths, giving short answers, going quiet. Some became anxious and withdrawn. Their schoolwork reportedly suffered. The relentless message that something is wrong with you didn't create a stutter, it created shame. It created fear and self-doubt and a wound in how these children saw themselves. And for some of them, that wound didn't heal when the experiment ended. Decades later, as adults, some described lives shaped by the insecurity that had been planted in them as children, a belief that they were somehow defective, that they had a problem, carried through an entire lifetime. And here's a detail that makes it more human, not less. The graduate student who carried out the experiment appears to have been deeply troubled by what she was doing. She later returned to the orphanage, more than once, trying to undo the damage, trying to reassure the children, to reverse what had been done. But you cannot always unsay things to a child. She wrote, with clear regret, that she hadn't found them as free from the effects as she'd hoped. The words had already sunk in and taken root. That's the terrifying power at the center of this whole story. It is far, far easier to plant a harmful belief in a person than to remove it. But the scientists knew something else, too, that what they'd done looked monstrous. And so they made a decision that kept this buried for 60 years. The experiment was never published. The findings were quietly shelved and hidden away. Part of it was shame, and part of it was timing. This was the era when the world was learning the full horror of what had been done in the name of science during the Second World War, and the very idea of experimenting on defenseless human beings had become toxic. So the study vanished into a drawer. But it wasn't entirely forgotten. Some of the scientists' own colleagues at the university knew about it, and they were so disturbed by it that they gave it the name that stuck, the monster study. Not because of the intent, but because of what it meant. Adults deliberately trying to damage orphan children to test an idea. For roughly 60 years, it stayed hidden. Then, decades later, an investigative journalist uncovered the story and brought it to the world. The university publicly apologized, calling it regrettable under any circumstances. And years after that, several of the now elderly survivors, people who had spent their whole lives carrying the effects, sued and the state settled, paying them for the harm done to them as children. Now, I owe you the honest, complicated truth because it matters. First, the scientists almost certainly did not set out to be cruel. They believed they were doing real science that might one day help children. And the young woman who ran it clearly agonized over it and tried to make it right. Many experts argue that calling them monsters is unfair to their intent. The harm was real, but the malice was not. Second, as we said, the experiment didn't even prove its point. And third, this is the part that should genuinely haunt you. The theory those children were harmed to support went on to become hugely influential. For decades, parents around the world were told, based on this line of thinking, never to draw attention to a child's speech bumps. But modern science has since found that stuttering has strong genetic and neurological roots. It is not simply created by labeling. In other words, the big idea this whole tragic episode fed into turned out to be largely wrong. Children were damaged in the service of a theory that time has mostly overturned. That is the deepest tragedy here, harm inflicted not just cruelly but pointlessly. So why does a hidden experiment on orphans from 1939 matter to you right now? Because even though the scientists failed to prove what they wanted, they accidentally demonstrated something far more universal and far more important. And it's happening around you and inside you every single day. They prove the terrifying power of a label, that if you tell a person, especially repeatedly, especially from a position of authority, this is what you are, they will often start to become it. Not through magic, through belief. The child told they're the stupid one, the difficult one, the shy one, the problem child. They absorb that label, and quietly grow into it? Because a child believes what the adults around them insist is true. This is real. It has a name in psychology, the self-fulfilling prophecy, and it shapes millions of lives. And it doesn't stop in childhood. Think about the labels placed on you. By a parent who decided who you were. By a teacher, a partner, a boss who told you what you're capable of. Some of who you think you are was handed to you by other people's words, repeated until you stopped questioning them. But here's the most important part, the one that should stop you cold. The most relentless labeler in your life isn't out there, it's you. Listen to your own inner voice. I'm not smart enough. I always mess things up. I'm just an anxious person. I'm not the kind of person who can do that. Every time you repeat one of those, you are running your own private version of the monster study on yourself. Standing over your own mind with a clipboard, telling yourself over and over that you're broken. And just like those children, part of you believes it and grows into it. So here's your defense, and it's powerful. First, question the labels other people gave you. Ask, is this actually true? Or is it just something that was repeated at me until I accepted it? You are allowed to reject a verdict someone else handed down about who you are. Second, be extraordinarily careful with the labels you put on others, especially children, because your words become the voice inside their head for decades. And third, the big one. Audit your own self-talk like it's the most important experiment of your life, because it is. The words you repeat to yourself are quietly shaping who you become. So choose them like they have power, because the monster study proved, beyond any doubt, that they do. So here's what to carry out of this. Those children were told a lie about who they were by people they had no choice but to trust, and some of them believed that lie for the rest of their lives. It wasn't their fault. They were children, and they were alone, and they had no power to reject it. But you're not a child, and you're not alone with someone else's clipboard. You have the one thing those orphans never got, the power to look at a label, whether it was placed on you by someone else or by your own inner voice, and say, no, that was never true. The monster study proved that words can wound a person from the inside, but the same power runs in reverse. The words you choose, for others and for yourself, can heal and build and free. Guard your voice. Guard the voices of the people who depend on you. And never let anyone, including yourself, convince you that you're broken. If this one stayed with you, the next goes even deeper into how the mind gets shaped without us realizing. Subscribe, and let's keep pulling these threads. This is Never Heard About.